Hello, everyone. My name is Michaela Wright, and I am the mission officer at YWCA Mahoning Valley. It is February, which means it is Black History Month. So happy Black History Month to you all. To celebrate, we will be hearing from select individuals on special themes and topics through the lens of the African American experience. And today, we will hear from fiber artist Joyce Morrow Jones. She is an artist based in Cleveland, Ohio, and she will talk to us about her artwork. She was also a participating artist and award winner in YWCA Mahoning Valley's Woman Artists a Celebration show. So thank you so much, Joyce, for being here today.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really, really excited. Even more so than um, talking about Black History Month and African American artists. I also want to make a disclaimer that I was also a staff member of the YWCA of Greater Cleveland. It was one of the first jobs that I had secured after college. And that was very, very instrumental for me because the mission of the YWCA became part of my core beliefs and also part of my art practice. More specifically, empowering women and promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. I mean, those are all, and the elimination of racism. I say that because our journey begins at a lot of different places. And for me, my experience with the YWCA was critical. Um, but before I joined the YWCA as a program director, I recall that as a teenager, a young teenager, my sisters and I also participated in a lot of the girl empowerment programs. And those programs were really instrumental in just helping to shape who we are and who we were to become. So some of my first mentors, Black female mentors, actually came from the YWCA. Juanita Dalton Robinson was the executive director. Assistant director was Dr. Dottie Hendrick Sterling, two very, very strong women in Cleveland. So it's always good to shout out because their legacy continues on in and through each one of us as we've been impacted by their leadership. I also wanted to say that, participating in the Celebration of Women Artists, part of my excitement was because of how I resonate with the YWCA's mission. So I'm always very grateful and thankful. So I am a mixed media fiber artist. However, understanding what that is and talking about it, I think is also part of my journey. I started out with crafts and sewing, so I never really considered myself an artist. However, after entering one of my dolls in 2016 in an exhibition in Harlem, New York, I began calling myself a folk artist. Maybe it was apologetic because I didn't feel like I met the standard of what most people would consider to be a fine artist. But after showing my work to different people, it was a cultural anthropologist, Dr. Ade Afuni, who saw my work and he said, "You are an artist." And that affirmation was really important to me. And he said, "Your work needs to be seen in galleries and museums." And I was kind of shocked. So, part of our self-esteem, comes into play in terms of how we walk into roles or how we claim different roles. So I began telling people that I'm an artist, and the first thing they would say is, "Oh, are you a painter? Are you a sculptor?" And I didn't really fit into any of those categories. So I said, "Well, I work in mixed media arts," and they had no idea what I was talking about. So then I began to say, "Okay, I'm a doll artist." And then there was this big question mark on their head because most people, when they think of dolls, they think of somebody that children play with. And they were trying to figure out how would a doll artist be important in the field of art. So then I began sharing the stories or the inspirations behind what I created. And that's when art teachers and curators said, "Oh, you're a figurative artist. And that began to make sense because as I tried to enter my dowels into fine arts exhibitions, I wasn't getting selected. It was only when I began labeling them as figurative sculpture that it was a second look. It wasn't something that looked like a dowel, but it was something that they could understand in terms of their field of practice. And that's how it started for me. So once my dowels became part of exhibitions, then I could call them dowels. But before then, it became figurative sculpture. And that led me to, again, try to embrace what is it that I'm actually doing. Because in indigenous cultures, the word art and artist don't exist. Those are our Western terms that we put on what we see in indigenous cultures. And as I began delving into that, and part of my background in college was African studies and Black studies. So I began kind of reaching back into that and that research. And basically, the best visualization I can give to you about what an indigenous culture would call an artist, and that would be a magician. I mean, it's like pulling concepts that you can only imagine in your fantasy or within, your spiritual practice and visualize it and then utilize the materials to bring it into light. So it's kind of like, pulling from the ethers and putting it into a physical form. Even if it's something as functional as a basket, the decorations or the tools or the techniques all were created through a process that's not easily defined because it's so part of what that culture would use in terms of understanding the metaphysical, the spiritual, the natural materials. All those things come into play. That resonated more to me. And there's still not a word that I can say what that is, but that is part of my art practice and my understanding of what is art. And because even if you look at a simple landscape, that landscape is going to conjure memories or conjure a sense of peace or emotion, or it's going to evoke something or conjure something within you. So that process can't be put into a box and say that's art. And as African Americans, I've seen a lot of different expressions of art forms. So we can't even within that realm of culture, we can't even put it into one category because they're so expressive of so many things. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because when I'm out teaching in the community, there are so many times I can tell you, maybe too numerous to even want to admit to. Children will say to me, "You are the first artist I've ever met." And so the exposure that we have in the community and also what we show to present to the community, I think is very important, just kind of
Absolutely.
moving forward. Um,
Sure.
mhm.
It sounds like this is very important to have that exposure. I love the terminology that you use with the indigenous definition, which you said there isn't really a word for it, but the conjuring or evoking of an emotion or a feeling. That whole magician terminology is really, it makes you think outside of the box that sometimes we just limit the term artist to, a certain type of medium or a certain type of, process. And so I love hearing about your inspiration from your early work and how you had someone who recognized your value and your worth and really instilled that confidence in you to start defining your artwork for yourself. So that's really amazing to hear. And so as we think about um, exposure or inspiration or what led you to your art, I want to ask, how has the creativity of your ancestors inspired your work?
Okay. And that's really interesting because as I've participated as an artist in residence, people always want to know, well, what is your background? And while I can say on my maternal side, it's Jamaican. On my father's side, is more mixed, more African ancestry. There's also a lot of Mediterranean roots in there. I can't say that any of that shows up prominently in my art, but what I've come to understand is the ancestral collective. That means all the ancestors who have gone on before us. It's their history, it's their experiences that show up, and it's about how we connect to that ancestral collective. Um, so while I've never gone to Africa, when people see my work, they can't believe I've never been to Africa
Mm,
because it's the influence is so strong. It's like, how are you even pulling that forward if you've never been?
mhm.
And so it becomes more of a spiritual and metaphysical process for me, drawing from those experiences. But I think what really helped was when I first started making my dolls. I was just kind of making them cute. I was kind of dressing them up. I was using some of my experience in costume design. But and most of them were soft sculpture dolls. I woke up one morning and I heard this voice, and it was a female voice, and it was so prominent, which said, "Can you tell my story?" And I'm like, who the heck is asking me that question? And there was no answer for that. But it plagued me. Every morning I would hear the same voice. Can you tell my story? And that's when I began to understand that this is about the ancestral collective. What are the shared experiences that we have that if I were to put it, create it, or express it in art, that anyone could see themselves in that, or part of their story, or this was grandma, or this was mom,
Mhm.
or this was dad, and what is their story? So when because I was trying to focus so much on the question, and I wasn't getting any answers, I kind of put it aside and just said, let me just start just working on my dolls. And I was working on the dolls, the stories started coming to me. And it was like an every woman story. And it was about, that resonation. So I started sharing what I was creating in a women's a, a Facebook group of women who were from different spiritual traditions. And as I was sharing the images, the story started pouring out. I mean, in the comments, they weren't just saying, "Oh, I like this," or "This is really cute." They were like putting their stories. They were writing stories about the images that they were seeing that I
Mm,
was posting, and that's when I realized it's not about me anymore. This is about what is being conjured, what is being invoked from the viewers. And that's when I began to understand the power of storytelling. So in my art statements, I always say that it is the art of story that inspires my art. A lot of times it is a story that comes first, and then the images come from that.
wow,
Sometimes they might be working with a specific material, but for the most part, it's about embracing that power of story.
that's amazing. I love the stories that art can tell. And not only is your art telling the story from the voice you heard, but it is encouraging or empowering other women to share their stories as well. And that is really powerful. Um, so, going with that, I am interested to know about the flowers that you have going on off
Mhm.
the top of your head. But if you could elaborate on how your fiber work began and maybe talk about, I'm hinting towards this I Blossom series.
Yes. So, in the middle of winter, I have this flower crown on my head, and it is to celebrate one of my art series, which is called I Blossom. And the I Blossom series is about the seeds that we plant during our journey as a woman, and how those seeds blossom at different times. It's almost like a rite of passage. If we can, visualize going through the teenage years, and what are the seeds that we're planting for ourselves? Are there seeds of affirmation, seeds of joy? Um, are we, what happens as we plant seeds during a time of sorrow or a time of grief or a time where our confidence isn't very low? But at some point, when we move through that rite of passage, we can see that something has changed, something has transformed. And for me, because I am very spiritual, when I look at women, I can see an aura, and that aura I see as flowers, not as a halo per se, but it is kind of like an aura of flowers. And so when I started with the concept of I Blossom, it was about creating images, multicultural images of women with these beautiful floral auras. And each one of these creations that you see on the screen, every female persona has their own story. And I share those stories when I exhibit those dolls. One of the reasons why it became important for me to start with dolls first, but it's eventually morphed into other art, mixed media art forms, is because dolls are one of the first connections that we have with our best friend. Their dolls become our confidant, something that we hug. So even though it's an inanimate object, they become live for us. And so presenting these stories through my dolls, um, I think is important because especially adult women, when they look at these doll sculptures, they're connecting to a part of themselves when they were a kid. I mean, it's almost like it takes them back to a time that was very precious. So even though they're more figurative sculpture, um, I think part of that emotional connection becomes stronger.
Okay.
So the I moved from dolls to more 2D hanging, but as you see, they still look very doll-like. And so people still call my 2D work dolls, because in their mind, in their imagination, these are all doll-like visual reminders. Uh, some of them have, I've been exploring with using a concept of floral yo-yos, and it's a quilting technique of making little rosettes. So I've been adapting those as actual flowers as well. So what do you think, Michaela, when you look at some of these images?
I, first of all, I think they're beautiful, but they also seem so symbolic, as you said. And I'm seeing in the photos that are being displayed now that the women have the flowers on their head as the dolls did. And so it's more of that telling a story, it's more of that representation, it's more of that connecting to the childhood experience, the first friend. I love all of what you said. So that is kind of what speaks to me as I see the dolls on the screen or even the 2D, the two-dimensional work.
Hmm.
Um, it's very, very powerful.
Yes.
I love that.
In the workshops, I found that it becomes a very spiritual process for the women. Sometimes we'll journal before, or I'll ask them, do a meditation and ask them to think of a time in their life in which they experience a blossoming.
Mm.
And there's always going to be tears because some people never had that question posed to them. There was one woman, she just started crying, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what's going on here? And she had just finished her last round of chemo and was clear. And
Wow.
she said, when I was going through this, she said, I never thought of what a blossoming could look like. And
Mm.
she said, I see it now. I mean, I still tear up when I tell that story because too often we struggle through life. So when I do the workshops, this is opportunity for women to kind of give back those stories, and I can continue to share what those stories are as I do art talks or residencies, or continue to inspire other women to during those workshops. So, but a
Um,
little bit about my other type of art, and I just want to just kind of say that the I Blossom series is just one of what I do. The doll making is also one specific part, but I work with a lot of the same materials that indigenous cultures would use. I use raffia, I use corn husk, I use other plant materials, other fibers. I use different types of clay. I use paper clay, polymer clay, and organic clay. I use a lot of recycled materials. And I teach that in my workshops because I want people to stop being a throwaway society. You know,
mhm,
the indigenous, they don't throw away anything. That's the reason why corn husk dolls are so important to any culture that actually produces corn, because the corn husk would normally become plant waste. So here in the United States, when we go to the grocery store and we shuck the corn at the stores, we could only bring home the ear of corn. Those don't go to a place where they could be recycled as
mhm.
yard waste. They go into our landfills. So I try to talk a little bit about that. Uh,
Well,
any any other
that's good.
questions?
Yes. As we wrap up, I want to ask one or two more questions, but I just find it interesting and important that we lift up how art is powerful, art is inspiring, but it's also useful and it's not wasteful. A lot of people don't see the benefit or the purpose behind art. And even with you saying you're using those indigenous materials or recycling, doing what we can to protect the planet as far as we can, or as best we can, rather. Um, that is really good. And so you talk a lot about the background of your art. You talked about the inspiration from your ancestors. Um, is there anything you can mention or speak to when it comes to the Black experience or how we can celebrate and support African American artists?
Yes. For one, African American artists do not do a good job in promoting themselves. Even in this age of social media, they think having an Instagram page or maybe a Facebook page, puts their art out there, and it really doesn't. We need to be a lot more visible. Um, and especially because when I first started, and I think as you saw through some of the images that I showed, I try to use all different types of skin colors, and I got a lot of pushback initially because I tried to feature a lot of dark skin um, images, and people would look at me, and I'm very fair skinned, and they would say, "Why are these dolls so dark?" And I'm like, "Because I think it's beautiful." And they're like, "Well, they couldn't understand why that was important to me." And for me, if you don't put the images out there, they're not totally representative of our skin color. And
Mhm,
it goes back to when I was growing up, there was a lot of colorism. The fair skin are the more elite. The dark skin, they're not the ones that you would want to see featured in magazines or on television. And we had to live through that type of I would say internal prejudice within our culture. Um, so for one, having lots of different artists out there promoting their work, we get to see a lot more representation of a lot of different things. But there's also cultural shaming. And because a good portion of my series of work deals with African art and African art styles, I would hear people ask me, is that voodoo? And I'm like, and I'm like, oh, what are you talking about?
Mhm.
If it was an African masquerade, or if it was something that was, Caribbean style, they didn't understand it. They didn't have a reference point for it, and the
Mhm.
only thing they could think of is what Hollywood has put out there. And so for me, putting my artwork out there and also having the ability to share the story and share the history of why certain art forms are necessary, and educating not just the general public, but also educating ourselves as to what is African art and what is African American art, what is Caribbean art styles. If we don't put it out there, people aren't exposed to it. And we can't assume that people have a general understanding because they don't.
Okay.
The other is um, to invite artists to schools. We don't have enough of that, and Black History Month is not big enough for us to begin to embrace artists. Throughout the year, artists should be coming to our schools, talking to kids, even if they're not doing a class. We need more teaching artists who are African American. I have been to numerous events where all the teaching artists were European, except for me.
Mhm.
So how are they going to meet an African American artist who teaches art? That's not necessarily an art teacher, but someone who's in the community and has the opportunity to not only expose at teaching art, but to also just be there to represent. I mean, if I'm going to be for real, I mean, they need to understand that. The
Absolutely.
other is, if you see an African American artist post an event, go to it, because
Mhm.
those numbers matter. When a gallery has to make a choice about who they're going to bring in for a show, if they bring in African American artists and no one walks through the gallery, no one comes, they have to make a choice, because I mean, numbers mean potential sales. It means that their gallery is getting exposure also during the time of that exhibition. So when
Mhm.
you only see a little trickling of people come through, and especially not even African American people coming through, they're they're going to start saying, well, you know what? I like your art, but I think this person will be a bigger draw. So
Mhm.
if we don't show up and we don't support, it also means that we're reducing opportunities for the future, not only for ourselves, but other African American artists.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. That's very important. So we touched on a lot today. And in those last comments that you made, I just want to point out how important it is to have representation, first of all, and that exposure for kids to be able to see African American artists, and for the African American community to be more open minded and embrace and be educated on culture, different cultures throughout the African diaspora and throughout the Black experience. Because when we talk about YWCA's mission of eliminating racism, a lot of that systemic pressure sometimes perpetuates or is perpetuated in our own communities as well, from the white supremacy that we've dealt with for so long. And so sometimes that allows us to go against each other. But I'm glad that you ended it with knowing how to look out for artists, Black artists, going and to support them, to uplift their work. And so I just really appreciate you being with us today and for sharing all your wonderful information, all your background, and all your work. So if you could just tell everyone where we can find your work online.
They can go to joycemorrowjones.com.
All
Um,
right.
yes, thank you very much. I really appreciate this opportunity, Michaela.
Thank you. We appreciate it. Bye bye.
Bye bye.